All right, we've done a lot of work with jQuery now, but we haven't had a big challenge yet. So we're going to have that in the next video, where we'll be building a form validation system, which checks whether the user has entered a valid email address, for example, whether the password is complicated enough, and whether the various other fields in the form have met the standards that we need. That's a really useful thing to be able to do for our sign-up forms, or any form really where we need the data to be in a certain format in order to use it in our system. So to do form validation, we need to learn another topic which, like Ajax, is something that a lot of people find a bit mysterious and confusing, but it's really not once you get to grips with it. And that is regular expressions. So regular expressions are really just a way to check the format or the content of a string. So we could check that it has a number in it, for example, or that it looks like a date, or that it's a password with a certain level of complexity, or an email address, or anything else. So let's get started. First off, I'm going to move back to my local version of jQuery.html. There we go. Just makes things a little bit faster, and regex will work fine on your local machine. Okay, so let's get rid of the content because we're working in pure jQuery for the moment. So how does this work? Well, first off, we define our regular expression, or our regex. And usually it's defined with slashes. So if, for example, I wanted to check for the word is in another string, then I would put is between two slashes like that. And that tells JavaScript, in this case, actually, there's nothing jQuery specific about that line, that this is a regex that we can then use to match against some other string. So let's then create our string. I'm going to optimistically write regex is great. You might not believe it yet, but you will do very soon. And then what I need to do if I want to match these up is I use the jQuery match function. And again, this is something that you can do with normal JavaScript, but it's a lot easier to do with jQuery. So let's create our result. So that's just another variable. And to get that, we start off with string, and then we apply the match function to it. And the match function takes one parameter or variable, and that's the regex, so the expression. So what this means is match the string, regex is great, according to the regex variable, i.e. /is/. What it means in English is, does the word is appear in the string, regex is great. We obviously know the answer is yes, but it's nice to know that our computer can work it out as well. So let's have a look. Is. So it doesn't return quite true or false, it returns what it finds, and that is. So it searches for is inside our string and it finds it, so it returns it. If we add a couple of letters on the end there, so it's no longer part of our string, then it returns null. So that means that this regex is not matched with this string. We can do a little bit more. In fact, we can do a lot more, but I'm just going to show you a couple of extra things here. If we search with a capital G, by default, that will return null because capital G REAT does not feature in this string. But if we wanted to do a case-insensitive search, we would just pop an I flag at the end there, so after the second slash, and that will then do a case-insensitive search, which will return great. And of course, if we could put capital E and a capital T for some reason there, and that would still match, but it would return GREAT. So it would return exactly what's in the string. Finally, we can also look for things that appear in the string more than once. So the letter E, for example. If we just run it as it is, then it will return a single E. So it will say, yes, E is present in the string. but we might want to know about every time that E appears in the string, or at least how many times it does. And if we want to do that, we use the /g for global, so the global flag, and that will then return every instance of this regex in the string. Let's take a look. There we go. So that's essentially a little array of E's to show every time we got a match between our string and our regex. So that's the basics of it. Regex is extremely powerful, and there's a lot more settings than what we've gone through there. But we'll cover many more of those in our jQuery challenge in the next video, where we'll be making a form validation system. Off we go then. So I'm going to begin by just adding my email input and email label and styling those so that everything looks like I want it to. So I did mention that there are things that we can use called labels, which attach themselves to inputs. So let's do a quick Google for something like labels for inputs HTML. Okay, the label tag, that looks like what we might want. Okay, and there we go. So looks like I can use label to just attach myself, or attach my label specifically to an input. All right, so we've pasted that in. Let's update things. So the label is connected to the input itself via its ID. Those are the things that are matching there. So I'm going to change my label to email, and I'll write email as the name for the label itself as well. This is not going to be a radio, this is going to be a text input. We'll have the name being email as well, the ID being email, and I don't want an initial value, so I'm going to get rid of that. But I will have a placeholder, because I think they usually look nice, e.g. your name at gmail.com, something like that. All right, let's take a look. Okay, not a bad start. We definitely want to do a fair bit of styling on this though. First off, let's change our fonts for everything to a nice sans serif font. I'll go for Helvetica and then sans serif if that fails. Oops, I've forgotten to put my style tag in there. There we go, and end that there. So that should change the font for everything to Helvetica. Oh, but only if I put a comma in between those two. Great. Next, I want to make everything a fair bit bigger. So let's try a font size of 300%. Oh, a little bit too large. 200%. That'll do. Next, I want to style my inputs. So let's add in some input styling. We'll start off with a height of, let's try 40 pixels. See how that looks. I think that's about right. It's not quite aligned correctly, but maybe a little bit taller. But actually, I also want some padding. So I'm going to put 5 pixels of padding in, and that should make it a little different. And I also want a larger font size. So let's go for a font size of, if it has a height of 40 pixels, 30 pixels. Sounds about right. Yeah, a little large, I think. Maybe 25. Okay, that looks more reasonable. I would like some rounded corners in there, so I'm going to add a border radius of, let's try 5 pixels. Okay, yeah, that's nice, but I don't quite like this sort of faux 3D effect there. So I'm going to set the border to do 1px solid grey. Okay, That's a bit neater. I don't like the centering in, the vertical centering of the text. So I'm going to get rid of that height and adjust the padding. So I like the amount of padding on the top, and I want to have the same amount on the bottom, and it's not quite centering that for me. So I'm going to go for 5px, 5px, and then let's try 15px on the bottom to give it a bit more padding there. Okay, that's good, but I think we've got a little bit too much. So let's try 10. Okay, just a touch more. There we go. Okay, I'm liking that. We do need a bit more width though. So let's try 300 pixels for our width. Yeah, maybe even a touch more. Try 320. Okay. Now I think my label is a little bit large, so I'll actually make that a touch smaller. And I also want to shift it down a little bit. It's not quite centered vertically with the input there. So I'm going to style my labels, and yeah, I should indent everything else a little bit. There we go. So we'll do this with relative positioning and give it a top of maybe 7 pixels. See how that looks. Oh, a bit too much. 4 pixels. There we go. Great. I'd like to center everything in the page. So you may remember how we do that from our big CSS project. We have some kind of container or wrapper div. Doesn't matter too much what you call it. The important thing are the styles that you give it. So let's give it a fixed width. Let's try 500 pixels initially, and then a margin, as you may remember, 0 for top and bottom and auto for left and right. And that will then center everything in the middle of the page. Okay, we may adjust our styling a little bit as we go, but let's start off with that and see how it works. Okay, so now we've got our email label. Let's add our telephone label. So we'll call it telephone, and it's still going to be text. And we'll give it a name of phone, ID of phone, and an EG of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The important thing is there's no spaces in there. So let's have a look. Okay, that looks good, but you can see that these labels have different widths. So let's try and fix that. And we should come across an interesting little issue. So if I try and set the width, not of the wrapper, but of the label to 150 pixels, nothing happens. So that's a bit of a mystery, and that's one of those things you could spend quite a while messing around trying to fix. So let's have a little look. Change label width HTML, something like that, and see if we can find an answer. Okay, how can I control the width of a label tag? That looks promising. Aha, so here we go. Label is an inline element. It cannot have a width value. In order to do this, you need to change the display type to display block or float left. So we'll use float left because we want it to appear to the left of our input. There we go. That looks a lot better. Had we used display is block, our width still would have worked, but it would have been above the input, which is not what we wanted. So let's go for floating left. And these are a bit too close, I think, now. So let's add a bit of a margin. I think it's probably worth putting them in a div with a class of something like form element. There we go. Rather than applying the margins to the labels and the inputs directly, which doesn't seem right somehow. So another one there. Form element. That also gives us a nice container for our labels and inputs as well, which feels right. Okay, and then we can take our form element divs, and I'm just going to go for a margin bottom of, say, 10 pixels. Let's give that a look. Excellent. Much more nicely spaced out. Okay, now let's add our password fields. So I'm going to copy that whole div there. For password. And we'll call it password as well. So this is going to have a type of text, but we can actually use a type of password, which will work in exactly the same way as text, but it won't display the text when the user types it. So more secure if someone's looking over their shoulder. So a type of password, name will be password, and ID will be password, and we won't have a placeholder this time. Okay, looks good. And then we might have a bit of an issue with space here. But let's see what pops up. Okay, we could do it like that, but that doesn't look particularly neat. So let's change our sizes a little bit. I'll just call this password confirm. Oops, the type is still the same. It's only the name and ID that change. And then let's do a bit of restyling. So let's look at 150%. And maybe increase the width of our wrapper a little. That's too much. Okay, and that will hopefully allow us to have a wider label. There we go. Just a touch too close there, I think. Let's make it 130% on the sizes. Great. Now we just need to adjust the label positioning. So we'll go for about 15, a little too much. Try 12. Okay, that looks good. All right, all that remains then for our HTML is our submit button. So it's a form element. So let's put it inside one of those divs. It doesn't need a label. We could use an input or a button here. Doesn't really matter. But if we're going to use an input, we need a type of submit. And then I'll give it an ID of submit button and a value of sign up. Okay, so I already quite like the styling of it, but we need to adjust it a little bit. So let's give it some custom styles. I called it submit button. So first off, it's a bit too wide. So let's give it its own width of, let's say 100 pixels. Oh, a bit narrow. 130, that looks about right. And also I'd like it to be lined up with these inputs here. So I'm going to give it a margin left of 200 pixels, should work. There we go. Brilliant. So there's our form. It's not exactly a work of art, but it's pretty neat and it does the job. Now for the interesting bit. Let's start doing some validation. So we want our validation to happen when the sign up button is clicked. So let's add that in first off for our JavaScript. So the sign up button is submit button. So let's select it in the usual way with a hash and then its name. So submit button. And we want to do something when the submit button is clicked. And that something is going to be a function. As always, I like to know that everything's connected nicely. So let's do a quick check. Oh no, something's gone horribly wrong. I've got too many parentheses there. Let's try that again. Sign up. There we go. Great, so we'll work our way down from top to bottom for our validation. So we'll start with the email, which is the most complicated. But as I mentioned, I wouldn't recommend you come up with your own email validating function. The internet's already done it for you. So let's have a look at, well, we could use JavaScript, but why not go for jQuery? Email validation function. So email validation using jQuery, that looks promising. Here we go. So we've got a very, very complicated regular expression there. I'm not going to go into the precise meanings of all of this, but you can probably just about work out that we're looking for a string of small letters or big letters or numbers or these punctuation marks and then an @ symbol and then some more small letters or big letters or numbers or a dash and then a range of potential .coms or .co.uk's, etc. If you're really into regex, you can go into that in a lot more detail and figure out exactly what's going on. But for our purposes, that will be enough. So this is a nice function that we can use to validate an email address. So let's pop it at the beginning of our code here. And we'll just spread it out a little so it looks nice. There we go. So you can see this is going to return regex.test. Now test is a JavaScript function that we haven't seen yet, so we're not certain exactly whether that's going to give us true or false, or the email address, or what. So let's find out. So we need to run this test against the contents of this HTML input, which you remember has an ID of email. So let's select it. Now we need to get its value, which we could Google and try and find out, but I think we could just guess. Maybe with jQuery we need to do dot and then val. That looks promising. So let's get its value. And remember, if we send no parameters, that implies that we want to get the value rather than set the value. So that will give us the value, and what we want is to run the function isEmail on that. And let's then alert the outcome of that to see what it looks like. All right, let's take a look. So if I click there, so false. So it looks like we're getting true or false here. Let's just put in ASDF, that's false. If we put in ASDF at asdf.com, it becomes true. Excellent. So this is looking like exactly what we need. If it's a valid email address, then it'll be true. If not, it's false. Brilliant. So we can actually put that straight into an if statement. And remember, this is going to be true or false, so I don't even need to put is equal to true. But what I do need is to test whether this is false, because what I'm interested in is getting an error here. So I'm actually going to put is not equal to, or, so I'm actually going to put is equal to false, because that's what I'm particularly interested in. And if it is, we want to show an error message of some sort. So let's think for a moment how we're going to do that. There could well be more than one error with this form. So what we don't want to do is alert each one or anything like that. But we do want to display every error so that the user doesn't fix one and then submit again and then realize there's another one. So the way I'm going to deal with that is to have a variable called error message, which is initially empty. And then if we get any of these errors, I'm going to add some text to the error message. And then at the end, we'll display the whole error message. That's quite a nice way round when you've got potentially lots of different things to say to your users, but also potentially none. Start off with an empty string and then add the issues in as you go. So let's append to error message, which you'll remember we do using plus equals. And we'll say your email address is not valid. And for now, just to check, we'll alert error message. Okay, let's take a look. Your email address is not valid. Fantastic. In fact, I'm going to put paragraph tags around that so that our error message will appear on separate lines. All right, so now on to the telephone number. So the validation here is we want to check if the phone number is numeric or not. And I did give you a clue at the beginning that there is a jQuery function to do exactly that. So let's see if we can discover what it is. So now we're looking at string phone with an ID of phone. And we want to check whether that is numeric or not. And there is indeed a jQuery function that we can access. Remember, using string dot to get all the jQuery functions is numeric. So if we pop .val again onto the end of that, that will test to see if the phone number that they've entered is a number. We could use a regular expression for that as well, but as jQuery has a built-in function, we might as well use that. So we actually want to check if that is false, because we're interested in when it's not numeric. So P, your phone number is not numeric. These may not be the most useful error messages, by the way. They'll serve our purposes, but you probably want something a bit more friendly. Let's have a look. Yep, so we've got email address is not valid, phone number is not numeric. But if we do put a number in there, then we just get the email address is not valid. Wonderful. Now for our passwords, the main thing we want to check here is that they're the same. So that's fairly straightforward. So our two IDs are password confirm and password. So if password dot val is equal to password confirm dot val. In fact, once again, we're not interested in whether they're equal to each other. We're interested if they're not equal to each other. So error message plus equals P, your passwords don't match. So let's have a look. If I just put two different passwords in, we get the email address, but not this one. I think that's because I forgot to put a hash in there. Let's have a look again. That's better. Your passwords don't match. And I've forgotten a closing paragraph tag as well. Alright, so that's most of the validation done. The final step I want to do is introduce check just to make sure that they've filled something in each of these fields. And again, that's something that we don't really want to give them a separate message. The email is missing, the telephone is missing, the password is missing, the confirmation is missing. I want to do that all in one error message if I can. So the way I'm going to deal with that is similar to how I dealt with error message up here. I'm going to have fields missing, which is initially empty. And then if the email value is empty, then fields missing, append to that. I'm going to give it a line break, so it's going to be on a new line, and then email. Then I'm going to add something very similar for the rest. So if the phone number is missing, then the fields missing gets telephone added to it, again with a BR for the line break. If password is missing, then we add password to it, and if password confirm is missing, then confirm password gets added to fields missing. Then we check if fields missing is not an empty string. Then we add to error message the following fields are missing, and then we append to that fields missing. If you wanted, you could add a little bit of code that works out whether one or more fields are missing, so you get the correct singular or plural, but I'll just leave it like that for now. Okay, so let's have a look. What if we leave all of these blank then? Yep, we're getting the following fields are missing. Fantastic. So we should now be checking for a numeric telephone, for a valid email address, for matching passwords, and for all of these fields to be filled in. So we don't want to alert the message in that way. We want to be a bit more stylish than that. So what we'll do is inside our wrapper, at the beginning we'll have a div with an ID of error message. So that's where our error messages are going to go. And then once we've run through this whole process, if the variable error message is not an empty string, then we'll display the error to the user. So we'll do that using error message to select the error message div, and we'll set the HTML of that to error message. All right, let's take a look. Fantastic. That looks great. That's exactly the errors that I would expect. If we just add in some numbers and a couple of random passwords to mess things up a little bit. So we're still missing the email address, but the email address is also not valid and the passwords don't match. Fantastic. So just a couple of things to finish things off. I'm going to add a little bit of styling to error message. I'm going to make the text color red, and I'm going to make the font size a little bit smaller just so it looks a bit neater. So font size body is 130, so let's try 110, see how that looks. We have to make sure that it's obeying this one. And remember, we've seen that if we put !important, then that one will override any other CSS instructions. So let's have a look at that. Better, but still a bit large, I think. Let's go for 90%. Okay, I think that looks better. All right, so the final thing I want to add on is a nice friendly message if the user has finally been successful in this form. So that will happen when error message is empty. So we can just use an else here. And then let's give ourselves a success div. So success message, which is going to be pretty similar to error message, except it's going to be green. And the way I'm going to do success message, because there's only one success message, is I'm going to start it off hidden. And I'm going to put the content of the success message in here, which I'm happier with. I prefer to have the content in the HTML if possible. So you did it. Congratulations. Of course, normally we'd be redirecting someone to their logged in page and getting them to use the app or whatever service they're signing up for. But for now, we'll just show them a nice friendly message. So here, we'll take success message. Don't forget the hash. And all we need to do is show it. We could use CSS here to display it, but show is easy enough. And actually, I also want to hide error message, because we don't want those error messages still displaying. Once the user has got it right. Wonderful. So let's take a final look. So I'm going to put in hopefully correct answers to each of these. Sign up, and there we go. You did it. Congratulations. Maybe a touch of padding on the bottom there. Or margin would do as well. There we go. Better. Brilliant. So I hope you had fun with that. And as always, I hope you managed to do at least some of it on your own. We're now going to shift gears slightly and look at the jQuery UI plugin and how we can use that to create some fancy user interface elements really easily. And we'll be working towards our big jQuery project at the end of this section, which is Code Player. Now that we've mastered form validation, we're going to move on to something a little different. At the beginning of this section, I mentioned that one of the great advantages of using something like jQuery is the huge number of plugins that are built for it, and I showed you some of those to whet your appetite. So for the next few videos, we're going to look in a bit more detail at one of those plugins to give you a bit of an idea how you might integrate plugins into your websites and use the documentation provided to get set up and to customize your installation exactly how you need it. So let's start by jumping over to jQueryui.com and just reminding ourselves what it is. Got a nice definition there. jQuery UI is a curated set of user interface interactions, effects and widgets and themes built on top of jQuery. So we're just going to go through a few of those. Essentially, we'll select some of the most popular options from the left there, and we'll look at the documentation in a little bit of detail to see how you can set up not only the default draggable, droppable, resizable widgets, etc., but also customize them to behave exactly how you want them to. So here's a quick little challenge for you. Can you work out how to integrate the jQuery UI JavaScript into your web page? I'll give you a clue. It's a very similar process to how we integrated jQuery in the first place. So think back to that. Best of luck. All right, hope you managed it. Your eye should have been caught by this quick downloads option here, and I would have recommended going for the stable download. So I'm going to download it again directly into my jQuery folder. You can see it's a zip file here, so we're not certain exactly what it's going to contain, but I'm going to click on it there to unzip it, and then so this gives us a jQuery UI folder which has a bunch of CSS and JavaScript as well as some images. And this index.html looks to me like it will be an example page. So let's have a look. Open with Google Chrome. We'll see what's going on there. There we go. So we can see that jQuery UI is installed and working here. So let's have a quick look at the code, which we do using right click or control click and view page source. So at the top here you can see that we've got a style sheet, jQuery-ui.css, linked there. So let's pop that in. Our code. Remember, it's in a subfolder, so we need to give it the correct location. I'm going to rename that subfolder just so it's a bit simpler to just jQuery-ui. So we want jQuery-ui / jQueryui.css. Okay, there's some custom styles there. We don't need those. What we really want is the jQuery UI JavaScript, which I suspect is at the bottom of the page here. There we go. So that's pretty straightforward. This is linking to jQuery, which we've already got set up on our page just there. So we don't need to do that, but we do need, of course, the jQuery UI JavaScript. I like to keep my JavaScript together away from my CSS. So there's jQuery. We just need to add again the subfolder jQuery UI and then the JavaScript. Okay, so notice I figured that out just by looking at the download. There is, of course, instructions on the site for getting started. And you may have found those scrolling down a little and then clicking on the Getting Started guide. And that would just lead you through the process of downloading, etc. But generally, if you're wanting to dive in with a new jQuery plugin, my advice is just download it and look through the files to see if you can get it set up yourself. Okay, so I'm just going to do a final test to see if this has all worked. I'm going to get rid of the custom styles from my form and everything else down there as well. We'll leave the script code. There we go. So final challenge then to test that this has been set up correctly. Can you set up a jQuery draggable element? I'll give you a clue. If you click View Source on jQuery.com, you'll get something that you should be able to copy and edit to meet your needs. Go for it. All right, I hope you managed that. Some of you may have noticed that you could have just copied and pasted this whole code and popped it into your HTML file, but that would have been slightly against the spirit of the thing. So let's try and do it ourselves. It certainly looks to me like the key line that we're interested in here is this one here, which looks to me like it takes the element with an ID of draggable and makes it draggable by applying the draggable function to it. So let's just copy that line of code and paste that into our script tags. And then let's just make an ID of draggable. And I'll just put some text in it. And with any luck, if we've connected everything up right, we'll be able to drag that around. There we go. So that's how easy it is to get started. As I've said, in the next couple of videos, we'll look at some other jQuery UI features in a bit more detail, specifically how we can customize them. And remember, the main reason for doing this is not to become jQuery UI experts, but it's to see how to use online documentation for things like jQuery plugins in order to apply them to your sites to make them more interactive, more powerful, and more fun to use. And we'll be starting with Resizables. So continuing our tour around the jQuery UI, so far we've set up a div with some text in it and we've made it draggable by applying the draggable function to it. And now we can drag it wherever we like. So what if we wanted to customize the way in which this was draggable, for example? We might want to only be able to drag it up and down, not left and right. Let's see if there's a way to do that. So here's the draggable page on jQueryui.com. If we have a look down at the examples on the right, we've got constrain movement. And this first example only allows you to be dragged up and down, and this one only left and right. So quick challenge, can you see the code? Work out how to apply that in our case to make our text only draggable vertically. Go for it. Okay, did you do it? Let's have a look. View source. There we go. So your eye should shift past all of this really, because we're not that interested in the styles. What we really want is this here. So it looks like if we add an option of axis and set it equal to Y, that will only allow it to be scrolled in the Y axis, i.e. the vertical axis. So let's have a look at that. So now we can drag only up and down. And of course, if I wanted to change that to horizontal, then that would apply as well. So I'm going to leave that. There. So you can see it in action. Let's have a little look at some of the other draggable options. So this one can be dragged about, but only within a certain area. And that one can only be dragged about within its small box as well. So can you figure out how to do that in our case? Did you manage it? Once again, it looks like it's quite straightforward. We can just set the containment parameter to a particular ID, or indeed just the parent, which looks like the simplest option for us. So let's check that out. See if we can make that happen. So we'll need a div which will be our box. So I'm going to be naughty and put some inline styles in there. So we'll just have width 400 pixels, height 300 pixels, and background color yellow. So have a little look. There we go. Great. And then inside that div, we'll have a little paragraph that says, I'm stuck in the box. And then, because that's our only paragraph, we can select it using a P. And then we want to apply draggable to it. And we want to set the containment parameter to parent. All right, let's give it a go. And indeed, we can only drag it in the box, which is great. Interestingly, we can only drag it up and down as well. Can you think about why that might be the case? I hope you figured that out. It's because we used a paragraph tag here, and a paragraph tag by default stretches across the whole width of its container. So I can't drag the paragraph left and right because it is already at the whole width of the box. So if I change the paragraph to a span, which doesn't span the whole width, then that should fix the issue, and now I can drag it up and down and also left and right. But I'm still stuck in the box. Alright, so there's obviously a lot more options we can do, but the last thing I want to show you about Draggables is the API documentation. So we've been working from examples here, which is all well and good, but sometimes you need a bit more than examples to work out exactly what's going on. And that's what the API documentation is for. And here you can see all the details of all the different things that we can do. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but for example, one of the options we can apply is to choose whether or not a certain class is applied, whether or not the draggable helper is added, etc., etc. And we've already seen the axis option. So that's where you get a lot more detail and usually some nice examples as well that you can see exactly how it works. All right, so let's jump back over and look at another jQuery interaction, resizable. So this one looks pretty straightforward. We can just resize an object using a little handle in the corner there. So can you create a resizable div in our code? Go for it. All right, hope you managed it. It's pretty straightforward. Again, we just apply the resizable function to our div. So let's create a div. Just as they've done, we'll give it an ID of resizable, and then we'll select it with JavaScript. Or in fact, we can just paste that straight in. So we're selecting the resizable div by its ID, and we're applying the resizable function to it. I'm just going to have a quick bit of style there for my resizable div, and we'll have width 100 pixels, height 100 pixels, and background color blue. Okay, there you go. So you can see we've got the handle right there for us, and we can of course drag this about. Great. Let's have a quick look at a couple of the options here. I think snap to grid could be very useful in some situations. So obviously there you're restraining the possible set of sizes. And then we can do that just by setting the grid property to 50. So let's do that here. Grid is 50. So that's 50 pixels for the grid width. There we go. We could also resize another element at the same time. There we go, just like that. Let's see how we do that. So we just add an option of also resize along with the selector for the element that we want to also resize, and we set the other element to be resizable as well. So let's try that. So we'll have div with an ID of also, just as they've done, and that's going to be quite similar in style to my initial one, but we'll make it red. And then we just need to add the property here. I'm going to put them on separate lines as we've seen before, with commas separating them. And then we want also resize. And we want to also resize the also div, the one with the also ID. And then remember, we just need to apply the resizable command to also as well. All right, let's have a look. Fantastic. So notice that grid only actually applies to the first one, but the second one does resize smoothly. Okay, so one final thing. What if you wanted something to happen when the width hit a certain size? You might be resizing this rectangle, and when the user goes above a certain width, you might want to change the page layout in some way. Well, a word should be coming into your mind when you're thinking of doing things like that, and that is a callback function, as we've seen before. So we're going to need to see how to find a callback function on our resize. Let's have a look again at the API documentation. And you can see we've got a bunch of options, which is what we've looked at so far. We've got methods, which are like functions that we can apply to our resizable. So we can destroy it, we can disable it, enable it, etc. And we've got events, and these are things that happen usually during the resize. So this is when it's created, this is when it's been resized, and when the resizing is started or stopped. So what we're interested in is doing something when it hits a certain size. So that's going to happen when it's been resized. So this is a JavaScript or jQuery event. We want to do something when that event happens. So you can see we've got various options again. I'm going to look for a code example. And this is then the crucial bit that we need here. So we've seen this before when we've done callback functions. This looks for a resize event, and when a resize event happens, we run a certain function. So that's what we're interested in here. So let's jump back over and see if we can apply that to our original resizer or resizable. So for now, let's just alert hello when the element has been resized. Let's see what that does. Oh, I have to get the right one. There we go. So it's alerted hello when we've completed a resize. We said that we wanted to do something if it reaches a certain width. So we'd have to get the width of our resizable. We know how to do that. We just select it in the usual way, resizable, and we get the width. This is particularly useful for us because it returns a number rather than if we use CSS width, then that will return the number plus px, which we're not particularly interested in here. We'd have to remove the px. So this is just a number, so we can then check to see if the width is greater than, for example, 300. And for now, what we'll do is just alert big enough. Something like that. So let's have a look. Once we get to bigger than 300, we get to big enough. And notice I didn't stop the resizing. I'm still resizing, and we still get this pop up here. So this is how we add a callback function to our resizable to do something when it's been resized. All right, now we're going to move on and look at an element that was designed with a callback function in mind. Great, so we've looked at draggables and resizables. Remember, our main aim here is to be comfortable with using documentation and examples to achieve what we want using, in this case, jQuery plugins. Now we've just got a couple more videos to go before we can do our big jQuery project code player. But here I'm going to set you a challenge. Can you create a little square and a big square, 2 different colors, and then make it so that you can drag the little square around, and when you drop it into the big square, you get an alert. Go for it. Okay, I hope you managed it. The idea, of course, was to use the droppable interaction in the jQuery UI. Let's find it. There it is. So this has got this built in that we can drag the first one around and then drop it into the second. So really all you need to do is understand how this works and then apply it to the example that I gave you. So let's have a look at the source of this example, which does everything that we want, except instead of alerting, the background goes yellow. So we're going to need to add our alert in instead. So let's have a look. First off, we make the first element draggable. That's fairly straightforward. We've seen that before. Then we make the second element droppable. And all we need to do is add a drop function and then run some code when that drop happens. And that's going to be where our alert goes. So pretty straightforward, right? Let's try it out. So we'll start almost from scratch. Because we're going to want those two boxes. So we'll leave resizable and also, but I'm going to rename them so it makes a bit more sense. So we'll have draggable and droppable. And draggable is going to be small and droppable will be big. Let's have a look. Okay, so that's what we want. Of course, I can't do any dragging or dropping as yet. What I want to do is take my draggable element and make it draggable. All right, let's just check that that works first off. Excellent. So it's draggable, but it's not yet droppable. So now it's just a matter of putting in our droppable code. So let's apply this to our droppable div. And now this is where we need to add the code here. So I need to copy everything between the two parentheses. I'm going to copy the whole lot and then explain it as we go through it. Let's have a look. So we're adding a drop function. And in fact, I'm going to get rid of this code because that's all specific to their example. So all we need to edit is what we want to happen when the drop happens. And this is it. So this is a function. Notice we've got event and UI here. They are parameters that will be returned and we can refer to if we want to. Let's have a little look and just see what they are. We'll need to look at the documentation for that. So we're working with an event here, and the event that we're working with is drop. And you can see here we've got event, and this will tell you what type of event has happened. Now the event, as we can see in the documentation here, is something like blur, focus, load, resize, etc. Now we've got a click option here, which may be what returns in this case, but what we're really doing is unclicking. We're lifting up our mouse to drop the object. So we'll have a look in a minute and see what event is actually returned, but that's not particularly important for us. The UI allows you to access various other bits of information. So if you had a number of items that could be droppable here, then we could access the item which was dropped so we'd know which one it was. And you can see we've got a helper object here as well. We can access the CSS position of the draggable helper and also the offset position of that object as well. So I wouldn't worry too much about these. I doubt you're going to need them unless you're doing anything particularly advanced, but they are information that we can access in our function if we want to. The main thing that we want to do though is just have an alert. So that's pretty straightforward, and I'll just say dropped. So let's take a look. So we can drag it around, pop it in there, and we get our alert. Fantastic. So I hope you managed to figure out how to do at least most of that yourself. One of the challenges of working with documentation is figuring out how far your understanding needs to go. And that will be definitely up to you and your situation and your personality as well. You might be the sort of person that really wants to be clear on what event and UI are, or you might not care at all as long as it works. But you need to be able to sort through the example code and all of the API examples to get what you need. All right, let's just have a quick look then and see what event has been returned here. So alerting it didn't give us anything particularly useful because it's an object. So let's see if we log it to the console. Maybe that will give us more of a clue as to what it actually involves. So I've just dragged it in and then control click or right click and inspect. And let's have a look at the console. So you can see we've got our event there. And here we go. We've actually got a lot of information in. So I'm not going to go through what all of this information is. Some of it you can probably work out. Most of it you're not going to be even remotely interested in. The thing I was particularly looking for was the type of event. And so it is in fact a drop. What you might be interested in is the to element, as I mentioned. So that tells you the element that has been dragged to it. And as well as the drop element that was dragged to. All right, so loads more information than you probably were interested in there. We'll go back to alert dropped for our sample code. The main point, once again, is that you need to be able to navigate the documentation to get the information that you need and be willing to put to one side the information that you don't need. All right, so one more video before we make our code player project is just looking at a couple of the widgets, and those are Accordion and Sortables. All right, so having looked at Droppables, we're going to look at two of the jQuery UI widgets before we make our code player project. So the first one is Accordion. And let's have a quick look first off and see what that means. And then I'll challenge you to make one yourself. So accordions are pretty simple. They look like this. They're a way of condensing a large amount of information into a relatively small space, and then the user can select which bit they're interested in reading at any one time. So they're quite useful. Our challenge then is just to recreate this more or less, but do it ourselves with our own text. So I'm going to give that to you. Go for it. All right, let's have a look then. See how they've done it. So the jQuery looks pretty straightforward. We just apply the accordion to the accordion div. And the div then contains, as obviously, an ID of accordion and then an h3 and then a div within it. And it looks like that's all we need. So let's try and recreate that structure. See if we can make it work. So we have a div ID of whatever we like, but accordion makes sense. And then within the accordion, we have an h3, which I'll just call title. And then we have a div with some content in it. I'm going to have some lorem ipsum, which you may remember is some Latin that we can use to generate some random text, which just makes our sample websites look good before our client has given us their website copy. All right, let's copy and paste that then. So we've got it a few more times, and let's have a look. Oh, that's very good. Of course, I've forgotten my bit of JavaScript here. Should be pretty simple. We just want to take the accordion element and apply the accordion function to it. And just before I run that, You might have noticed that I've managed to spell accordion wrong in each of those. Easily done, and would result in absolutely nothing happening because we have to spell the accordion function correctly. Let's take a look. All right, there we go. So it was indeed as simple as that. And with just one line of jQuery, we've got a really nice accordion effect there. It's worth speaking briefly about these styles. These are the default jQuery UI styles, but you can apply different styles using the jQuery UI themes. So you can see here, for example, they've applied the smoothness theme. And if you do a quick search for jQuery UI themes, there are a number of them out there that you can use, or you could actually start with something like this and create your own if you wanted something completely custom. Your final challenge then, before we move on to our Code Player project, is to create a sortable list using jQuery UI. Simple as that. Go for it. All right, hope you managed it. Let's see how we do it. It's up here where it says sortable. And very simply, we can just sort our elements into a certain order. I've actually used this in a few websites. It's a nice user interaction model. So let's have a quick look at the source. So we've got two instructions here. The first one makes sense. We're setting it to be sortable using the sortable function. And then we're doing the slightly strange disable selection. So let's firstly do things without that to see how it works, and then see why disable selection might be important. Okay, and then we've got a unordered list and a bunch of LIs with a bunch of spans and classes, which I don't think we need. So I'm going to try it without them. So let's do it under my accordion. We'll have a UL, again with an ID of sortable, and let's just put in some list items. I'll use my usual list items. Rob, Kirsten, Tommy, and Ralphie. All right, and then we just run our JavaScript or our jQuery. We're going to apply to the sortable div the function sortable. All right, let's refresh and take a look. So we've got a very normal looking list there, but we can indeed sort it. Wonderful. And I trust then that you could also extend that, and if you wanted something to happen when the user has resorted, then you could do that with a callback function, which you would find in the API documentation. Okay, so that's as far as we're going to go looking into the various different interactions and widgets, but there really are a bunch of very, very useful widgets here. The date picker, for example, is something that you've probably seen on several websites and is really useful. Autocomplete, that's something I mentioned again at the beginning of this chapter. That's a really useful thing to be able to do, and you can do it just straight away with jQuery UI. And feel free to have a click around and see how you might use some of these in the sites that you're working on. Brilliant. So that takes us to the end of our jQuery UI tour, and indeed to the jQuery section. So all that remains is to make what will probably be the biggest project so far, and that is Code Player. Let's find out what it is and how you're going to make it in the next video. Congratulations on making it to the end of the jQuery section of the Complete Web Developer course. We've gone from introducing jQuery and showing you why you might want to learn a JavaScript framework. Then we recreated a lot of the JavaScript techniques that we'd learned in the previous section in jQuery, and we saw that they were generally shorter, easier to read, and easier to extend and improve in jQuery. Then we moved on and we did some fancy animation and fading with jQuery, which was really easy. We saw how we could use jQuery and Ajax to build an interactive website that didn't require any page refreshes, which is really the most powerful thing that we've learned in this section. Then we learned about regular expressions and we did some form validation. And finally, we looked in detail at jQueryui.com as an example of a jQuery plugin and how we might use the general skills of looking at documentation and extracting the bits of code that we need to make our websites do what we want them to quickly and easily. So that's jQuery for you. I hope you like it. And now I'm going to give you an opportunity to practice what you've learned by building a project which I call Code Player. Now, if you remember back to the beginning of the course, I talked about how you might want to share the code that you're writing with others, either to get feedback or bug fixes, or to just share a good technique. And one of the websites I showed you was jsbin.com, which is a great way of doing that. And this is more or less what we're going to recreate with our Code Player. So we're going to build a slightly simplified version of this. It's going to have all the core functionality, that is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript panels, which appear and disappear as you click on them. We're going to miss out the console because that just adds unnecessary complexity at this point, I think, and we're going to have the output there on the right as well. So let me show you the final version of what we're going to produce, and then you can have a go at producing it yourself. So you can see the design of my version is pretty similar to JSBin. I've simplified it and I've renamed it to Code Player. But other than that, we've got the core toggle buttons at the top and then the two content frames here as well. And the toggle buttons, of course, work really well. We can switch off HTML, switch off CSS, and also JavaScript. So we've got all four happening at once here. And just like with JSBin, as soon as I change anything here, it's updated immediately in the output window over here. Exactly the same with styles and JavaScript. There we go. So that's basically it. As always, there's a couple of things that we haven't seen before, but they're pretty minor and you should be able to Google to get the answers. So have a go at it. Best of luck. Hope you managed to come up with something pretty close to this. But of course, as always, I'll show you how I solve the problems after the pause. Good luck. All right then. Hope that went well. Here we go. So let's get our basic framework up here. There we are. And then let's clear our file. Let's start with a look at jsbin.com and look at the overall style and layout of the page. We're going to want a bar up the top here with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and output buttons. And then I'd like to have Code Player as a little logo on the left there. And then below that, we want the rest of the screen to be divided into the 4 panes, which we're going to toggle on and off with those buttons. So I'm going to start by creating this top panel here, mostly using CSS. We'll move on to the main area after that. All right, so let's see if I can get that background gray color first off, using my color dropper or color picker that we've seen before. So I want to pick a color from the page, and the color looks like 1D, 1D, 1D. Oh, I've copied the wrong color, but I can remember the right one. Okay, so let's have a div with an ID of, let's call it header or top bar or something like that. And then within that, I want to have my logo on the left, which is just going to be a simple text Code Player, but I want that to appear on the left. And then I'm going to want a collection of these divs or buttons. I think I'm going to call them divs, and then that'll be easier to style them exactly how I want. So let's have a div to be our button container. And then within that, we'll have our buttons. So I'll give it a class of toggle button. And the first one's going to be HTML. And we'll need IDs for each of these as well, because we'll need to do something when each of them are pressed. So let's have our first one with a class of toggle button ID of HTML. Second one, class of toggle button ID of CSS. Third one, ID of JavaScript. And the fourth one with an ID of output. So in terms of content, that's all I need for my top bar. So let's see how it looks without any styling. Not great. Not to worry though, we can fix that easily enough. So first off, let's add our necessary styles. I'm going to change the body font to just a simple sans serif. Great. And then let's work our way down our HTML elements, applying our styles to them. So our header div, we want to have a width of 100%, a background color of, do you remember what it was? I think it was 1D, 1D, 1D. Let's just have a look. Nope, it definitely wasn't that. So I think we'll need to pull out the whole width to get what we need. There we go. All ease by the looks of it. Okay, that's better. We definitely want to get rid of any padding there. So let's add padding is 0 and margin is 0 to the body. There we go. But I think we can have a bit of padding in the header. So let's start with a padding of 5 pixels. Okay, that's beginning to look nice. And I'm going to leave my logo stylings for the moment because I want to see how much space I've got once I've styled the buttons. So let's style my button container next. And the main thing I want to do is center it and give it a certain width. So let's start with a width of 200 pixels. We'll probably need to increase that a little bit, but we'll see how it goes. And you'll probably remember a margin of 0 auto is what we need to center it. There we go. Obviously it doesn't look centered there, but that's okay because these are just aligned to the left. So the whole thing goes from about there to about there. All right, now let's apply some styles to our toggle buttons. The main thing we're going to want them to do is float left so that they happen one after the other. Great, that reminds me that we'll need to make the logo float left as well. So that everything is in line. And that means we're going to need a height for our header. Let's go for 20 pixels for the moment. We'll probably need to increase that a little bit. Okay, so it's already looking a lot better than what we started with. The main thing we're going to need next is this nice button styling. So let's apply that. First off, we'll have a border of 1px solid grey. Okay, not beautiful yet, but we'll get there. Let's increase our width there to 300 pixels. Let's introduce some padding. So let's try 4 pixels, see how that looks. Okay, not bad. Now you can see that we've got a kind of double border there because we've got the left border and the right borders together. And that's one thing that we don't want. So let's fix that by setting the border right to be none. And that then fixes that problem whilst introducing another problem that we don't have one on the right. But that's okay, we can fix that easy enough. And we're actually going to need some custom stylings for HTML and output anyway, because we want those to have the nice rounded effect. So let's apply that. We'll add a special style for HTML. So we want a border top left radius of, let's try 4 pixels, and a border bottom left radius of 4 pixels as well. Lovely. And then similarly for output, the rightmost div, this time we want a border top right radius of 4 pixels. We want a border bottom right radius of 4 pixels, and we want a border right of 1px solid grey. Beautiful. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. I think I want the text there to be a little bit smaller. So let's try setting the font size to 90%. Yep, I like that. And a little bit more padding. Great. Okay, you can spend a lot longer styling those as you wish, but I think that's good enough. Now that I've got these set up, I can change the width of my button container so it's correctly centered. So let's just experiment a little bit. Let's reduce it to 200 pixels. So that's too small, 230, still too small, 250 is big enough. So we essentially want to make this as small as we can without doubling up any of our rows. And then it will be correctly centered. There we go. So 233 is what we want. Great. So now our buttons look good. Obviously the header bar is not quite as high as I'd like. We could fix that with a width, with a height I mean. So let's experiment with that. 30 pixels, that looks actually pretty bang on. That'll do. So now let's just change the logo to have a font weight of bold, and let's try a font size of 120%. See how that looks. I think that's fine. We'll then give it a little bit of padding to move it around. So let's try 3 pixels at the top and 5 pixels left and right. I think that looks pretty good. Obviously it's not great styling, but it does the job. All right, so now we're more or less done with our top bar in terms of its layout and stylings. The next thing I'm going to look at is setting up the jQuery to apply the necessary effects in terms of the hovering and whether each item is selected. So let's set up the hovering first of all. We're going to do that with a bit of jQuery. And we want to apply our jQuery to all the toggle buttons. So we use the dot or period for our class selector. And we want to select toggle button. And you may remember the jQuery command hover, which is perfect for what we want here. And what we want to do is when the user hovers over one of these, we want to turn the background slightly darker. So we want to apply it to the one that the user is hovering over. And we do that using this, as we saw a few videos ago. And we want to set the background color to, let's just try gray, see how that looks. All right, that hasn't done anything. Not to panic. Let's inspect and see if we've got a problem in our jQuery somewhere. Ah, yes, in fact, my jQuery is completely wrong, isn't it? I've forgotten to say that we're defining a function here. And then we need to finish off our function down there. All right, let's try that again. Okay, that's better. So that works really well. One problem obviously that we've got here is that we're making the background color gray, but then we're not changing it back to what it was when the hover stops. That's not something we've seen how to do before, but it would be surprising if there wasn't something built into the jQuery hover function that could cope with that. So I'm just going to Google jQuery hover and let's have a look at the documentation and see if there's an easy way to deal with that. Aha, so it's looking like we've got a handler in and a handler out. So it is perfect for what we need. Bind two handlers to the matched elements to be executed when the mouse pointer enters and leaves the elements. So let's have a look at that example there. So it looks like all we need to do is add two functions. The first one will happen on the hover, and then the second one will happen when the user stops hovering. So that should be simple enough. So there's our first function. So we want to add the second one right after that. And that's going to do something very similar. So it's just going to take the CSS of this, so that is the element that's been hovered over, and set the background color back to the big string of E's that it was before. Okay, let's have a look. Much better. Great. Finally here, we need to have our buttons go blue when they are selected. And we want to have initially HTML and output selected. So the way I'm going to deal with that is have a class known as, or that I will call active. And we'll apply the active class when the user has selected to view whichever button we're talking about. So initially we want HTML and output to be active, but the others not. So let's decide our stylings. Oops. Actually, all we want is for the background color to be that nice shade of blue. So I'm going to have problems getting that with my color picker because it's going to overwrite it, I suspect. But I think it's the same as this shade of blue here. So I'm just going to use that shade of blue. Let's have a look. So we want to set the background color of anything with an active class to that blue. Wonderful. And finally, I want to make it so that when the user clicks on one of these, it becomes blue, or stops being blue if it was already blue. And I'm actually wondering if there might be a better way to do that. You'll notice that when we remove our hover, we lose the blue, which makes sense because we've set the background color back to the string of ease, which is the light gray. So actually, would it be better to have a class for this, essentially a highlighted class, and then toggle that class on the hover? Let's have a look. So we'll call it highlighted button, and all it is it's going to have a background color of gray, and then when we hover over, we want to add the class of highlighted button. And then when we stop hovering over, we want to remove the class of highlighted button. Now, add class and remove class are not functions that we've seen before, but with a little bit of Googling, you could get there. And then the advantage of this is it adds the class, but then it removes the class. So it retains whatever styling it had before. So that's a better way of doing it than just manually changing the background color. It also does a better job of keeping our styles and our code separate, so we don't have any hard-coded colors in our JavaScript. Great. So then we just need to make it so that when the user clicks, it adds or removes the active class. So that should be pretty straightforward. When the toggle button is clicked, we want to run a function, and this time we want to toggle the blue class. So I'm going to do a quick search for jQuery toggle class, because I think there's probably a way of doing it that makes that easy. Yep, look, we've got a toggle class function there. Let's have a look at an example. So toggle class looks to me like it's just going to add the class if it's not there and remove it if it is there. So that's perfect. So we want to take the element that's been clicked on, and we want to toggle the class of active. And this should add the class of active, which will make the background blue if it's not there, and it'll remove it. There we go, if it is there. Brilliant. The only slightly odd behavior there is that when we initially click, we've still got that background color of gray, so we don't see that it's been selected until we remove the mouse pointer. So to get around that, I'm just going to remove the highlighted button class whenever the user clicks on it. So that should give it a quicker bit of feedback. So if I now click there, you can see straight away that that's selected. If I click again, you can see straight away that it's not selected. Great, so now we've got our buttons behaving in the way we want to. Now the real challenge comes. We need to actually make the main content of the page. Let's start off by getting our HTML and output looking right and working correctly. Then we'll add in our CSS and JavaScript. So I'm going to make the HTML a text area and the output a div. So let's make that happen. So underneath the header section, we'll have a div. I'll just call it body container. And the first thing that we'll have there is a text area. It will have an ID of HTML text area. And let's give it a little bit of initial content. Hello world. All right, there we go. Very good. Let's next sort out the width and height. The only text areas I have are all going to have the same styles, so we're just going to style it using text area, but you could put a class in there if you prefer. And we want a width of initially 50% and a height of 100%. Let's have a look at that. Now that looks pretty good, but if we scroll down, you can see we've actually got a little bit more text area than we want. And that's because it's setting the height of the text area to the whole height of the page, which is not what we want. So as always, there's a number of ways to fix that. But as we're in a jQuery section, let's figure it out with jQuery. What we really want is the height of this text area to be equal to the height of the user's page minus the height at the top here. So what we don't know how to do there is get the page height. So let's have a quick Google. I'm sure there's a way to do it. Okay, so dot height we're aware of. Aha! Looks like that second one is actually what we want. So window height. So string and then window selects the window. Do we want the window height or the document height though? So looking at those definitions, we want the window height, the height of the user's screen. Okay, so let's set the text area height to be equal to the window height minus the height of the header. So that is header dot height. So we're setting the text area height to be equal to the height of the window minus the height of the header. Let's just have a look, and we'll just get rid of the CSS height command so we can see clearly what's going on. And you may have noticed I've forgotten my parentheses after height there. Okay, that's still a little bit large. I suspect that's down to some padding. So I'm going to subtract. Let's try an extra 10 pixels and see how that looks. Extra 15, that looks just about right. We also don't want this to be resizable. So let's see if there's an easy way to make text areas not resizable. There we go. Again, this is something we haven't done before. So we'll do a quick Google to find out how to do it. There we go. How to disable resizable property of text area. That looks very promising. Let's have a look. Resize is none. Okay, that should do it. So let's have a look. Excellent. So now no longer resizable. Wonderful. So now let's just add in our output. And actually, thinking about it, I think making it an iframe will be a lot easier because we want to be able to process code in this iframe. And that's a lot easier to do in an iframe than a div. So let's have an iframe with an ID of output. And just thinking about it there, I would like to have the same word after each of these. So after HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so that it's easy when someone clicks on them to find the corresponding element down here. So I think I'm going to change text area there to panel, just so that I can use the same word for all of them when I need to display or hide them later on. Okay, and Let's just have a look at that. All right, it's sort of in the right place, but we've got a little bit of work there. So let's have a panel class for each of those. I think the only thing we'll need for all of them is a float left, and actually that width being 50% could be in the panel class as well. Now that makes the iframe disappear completely, or does it? It's actually gone underneath because it's slightly too wide now, and that's because, remember, the width being 50%, a little bit of padding is added on to that, and similarly with the iframe. So the total width here is slightly more than 100%, which is why the iframe goes below the text area. So again, a number of ways to fix that, but I'm going to do it with jQuery, just like we did down here. So this time we're going to take our panel class and apply the width, or we're going to change the width of it to the window width. This time we don't want to get rid of a header, but we do want to divide it by 2. And then we want to subtract a certain number from that, which will be equal to our padding. There we go. So that looks a lot better. Let's just reduce that number as much as we can. I think that looks fine. And similarly, we can actually change the text area there to panel, because we want to change the iframe height as well. So that will then stretch the iframe all the way down to the bottom. The iframe, however, I don't think we need a border on at all. So let's remove that. There we go. And that actually makes me want to remove the border from the HTML at the top there. So let's add a border top none to our text areas. And that's now a bit striking as well. So I'm going to change the border color to grey. Great, I think that's a bit neater. Great. Now we just need to get the HTML to display in our iframe. This is something we haven't done before. So let's try something like iframe change HTML content. This looks good. We've changed the URL before, but we haven't changed the contents. There we go. So it looks like we can take the iframe and then just change the contents like that. They're changing the contents of a specific div, but we're going to change the contents of the whole thing. So let's just copy that code. Initially, let's just run this command when the page loads. I don't want to update a particular div. I want to update the whole HTML of the iframe. So I want to find the HTML tag and replace it with, just for now, my HTML. There we go. Great. So we've changed the code of the iframe, and you can see that we've got none of the same styles as for the rest of the page here, because this is a iframe within it, so it doesn't take on the styles, which is actually ideal for what we want, because then the user can use their own styles. All right. So it's all very well to make it update when the page loads, but we also want it to update when the user updates their content. And of course, we want to update it with their content, not my HTML every time. So first off, let's get the contents of the HTML text area. So that's just HTML panel and then .val to get the value. So let's just check that that works. Excellent. So it's now updating there. What we'd really like is for this to update immediately as we're typing our code. And for that, we'd need an event to trigger every time the text area was updated. So again, that's something we haven't done before. So let's see if there's a way to do it. jQuery event when text area updated, something like that. How can I bind the change event of a text area in jQuery? Gotta love Stack Overflow. So that top result looks good, but just having a look further down, bind is deprecated, so this looks ideal for us. So it selects a text area, and then on certain events happening, then a function will take place. And so they're fairly obvious. We've got change, we've got key up, so that's when the user lifts their fingers off a key, or when the user pastes something in. So this should cover every event of our text area changing. So let's add that code in, so we can select all of our text areas, even though we've only got one. And when that happens, we want this to update. Let's have a look. That's pretty awesome. And we could even put some HTML code in here. And it will apply that immediately. So this is pretty powerful, being able to do something as soon as the user changes the contents of a text area, or that would work just as well with an input as well. Great, so we're making pretty good progress. All we've got left to do is to bring in the CSS and JavaScript panels. So let's add them in as text areas. So we want a CSS panel and a JavaScript panel. And we'll have a little bit of demo CSS and JavaScript to get us started. So in our JavaScript, we'll just have alert, hi there. And in our CSS, we'll have some green standard text or paragraph text. Right, and initially we want those to be hidden. So let's have a hidden class, which will have a display property of none. So if we have a look at that, they won't display initially. But what we want, of course, is that when we click CSS, that the CSS appears. So we've already got a function that happens when the toggle button is clicked. So what we want to do is show or hide the respective panel when that button is clicked. So there's a few things that we'll need for this. We'll need to get the ID of the panel that we want to show or hide. And to get that, we'll need the ID of the button that was clicked. So to get the ID of the button that was clicked, we use this .attr for attributes and then ID. And then we're going to want to add the word panel onto the end of that. Because remember, we've got HTML panel, CSS panel, etc. Note there's a capital P there. So to keep our code reasonably readable, let's create a variable called panel ID, which is going to be the ID of the panel that we're going to show and hide. And let's just alert it quickly to make sure that we've got the right thing. Yep, that looks good. Okay, so then we can use the jQuery selector to select hash and then panel ID. And we want to toggle the class And the class we want to toggle is, I forgot what I call it, hidden. There we go. So let's have a look. If we now click HTML, you can see the HTML disappears and then it comes back. Wonderful. Incidentally, there is actually a jQuery function called toggle, which just displays or hides an element. So that's a little bit neater than toggle class in this case, because you don't actually need the class because the command is built into jQuery. Now you might be anticipating a problem we're going to have though. If we try and bring in the CSS panel, then that works great, but what it doesn't do is change our widths. Obviously, if we've got 3 panels, each of which have a width of 50%, that's going to go over the top width allowed on our page. So we're going to need to make the panels narrower the more we have of them. Fortunately, we have some code to do that, and that's this command here. So this changes the panel width. The problem is we're going to have to work out how many panels are being displayed at any one time. Now we could do that with a variable and then keep track of it and add one to it and subtract one to it each time an item is toggled, but I think there's a slightly neater way to do it. And that is if we could find a way in jQuery to count the number of elements with a certain class, that would give us the answer that we needed. So if we make that class hidden and go back from toggle to toggle class, so it was useful after all, then we could count the number that are hidden and subtract that from 4 to get the number that are active. So let's see if we can find a way to do that. jQuery count elements with a certain class. Counting elements by class. That looks good. And there we go. Once again, we see how easy and obvious jQuery is. We just use something like that. So we select the class that we want, and then we look for the length of that variable, and that will tell us the number of items with that class. So let's create another variable called number of active panels, and that's going to be equal to 4, which is our maximum possible, take away the number of inactive panels, which is the panels with the hidden class. And then instead of dividing by 2, we're going to divide by the number of active panels. So that should divide by 2 initially, and then 3 if we have 3, 4 if we have all 4. Let's take a look. Excellent. So now it's dividing it into 3 panels, add in JavaScript, and we get all 4. Fabulous. I hope you followed that bit. There was some quite complicated code there. Feel free to rewind the video and just watch that bit again if it was a little bit unclear. Okay, we can now see that we've got some slight issues with our borders there. So I'm just going to change panels to have a left border of none. Let's just have a look. Great, that looks a lot better. And there's also one issue that you might have imagined, that if we get rid of them all, then we're dividing by 4 take away 4, which is 0. Fortunately, this doesn't cause us a major problem because it means the JavaScript won't do anything here, but we don't need it to resize the width anyway because we've hidden everything. So actually it doesn't really matter, and we can just bring them back in the same way as before. All right, so we're pretty close now. What we need to do is to get our styles and JavaScript to happen in this iframe here. So let's head on down to where we would want that to happen. So at the moment, we're just putting in the contents of the HTML text area. So this is going to be a little bit messy, but it'll get the job done. What I'm going to do is manually put in our HTML page to insert our styles and our JavaScript. So I'm going to start with HTML and then head. We don't need a title because we're not displaying that anyway, but we do need some styles. So I'm going to have style and then type equals, and I'm going to use single quotes because I'm using double quotes for this whole string. And the type is text/CSS. And then I'm going to put in our CSS, which is the contents of the CSS panel. So it's CSS panel val. And then I'm going to end my styles. I'm going to end my head. I'm going to start my body. Then I'm going to have my HTML. And I'm going to leave the JavaScript for the moment for reasons that we'll see in a couple of minutes. But for now that I've got my body content, I'm going to close the body and close the HTML. So this should essentially create an inline HTML page with this content. So starting with HTML, then head, then it should put in all the styles that we've got in our CSS text area here. Then it closes the styles, closes the head, starts the body, puts the HTML panel content in, and then closes the body and closes HTML. So it will create a kind of full HTML page with the content and styling there. Let's not forget the close parenthesis there. And now we should find then that the HTML of the contents of our iframe should be updated to a full HTML file, essentially, with HTML and then a header with the style and then the styles of the CSS panel inserted there. Close the style, close the head, and start the body. Then put the HTML panel contents in there, and then close the body, close the HTML. So just to check that that is happening, let's update the HTML panel contents to contain a paragraph tag. Otherwise, the styles won't be applied to them. There we go. And now let's have a look. So we should now find when we update this, there we go. Now the styles are being applied as well as the content. Great. We want that, of course, to happen on page load as well. So one solution to do that would be to copy our iframe code and replace the update that we had at the beginning with that. But as we've seen, we don't like having two chunks of code that are exactly the same. So what I'm going to do is create a function called update output. Pretty straightforward, and that will just do the updating. And then we can call that both at the start of the page, when the page is loaded, and when we have any updates. So now when we run, we should find, yep, we get the styles applied as well on the initial setup. So now all that remains is our JavaScript. And this, as you might have gathered, is going to be slightly more complicated than applying the CSS. So what we can't do is just add a script tag here. You can feel free to try it, and it might even work in some browsers, but it definitely doesn't work in the version of Chrome that I'm working with here. And that's primarily for security reasons. Running JavaScript within an iframe is not considered ideal. And in fact, if you were making this site live and allowing people to actually use it, you'd want to be very careful about what JavaScript they were allowed to run here, because there are potentially ways to start running code on your server through a site like this. If you did have a project that did something like that and you wanted to do it securely, there's plenty of help out there. Google something like run JavaScript in iframe securely or something like that. The main thing is to bear in mind that executing JavaScript that your users can edit in an iframe on your server is a little bit risky, and you should take some security precautions. All right, so first off, how do we execute this JavaScript at all? What if we just wanted to run some random JavaScript that the user has entered? This is something that we haven't done before. So let's try searching for something like run a JavaScript string. Something like that, because essentially what we've got is a string and we want to run it as JavaScript. Okay, that eval function looks like it does what we need. Okay, fantastic. So eval just evaluates a string of JavaScript. Fabulous. That looks like it could be very useful for us. So let's try adding that to our update output function. So we'll just eval, and the thing we want to eval is the contents of the JavaScript panel. So let's get those. So we'll select the JavaScript panel and get the value. All right. And that actually did nothing. Why is that? Ah, yes. You can see, you may have spotted my deliberate mistake there. I forgot to close the double quotes on my JavaScript alert function. So let's try that again. There we go. Right, so we're running our JavaScript, which is great, but we're not quite done yet because we're running the JavaScript on the original site at the moment, and we want to run it in the iframe. Now with something like an alert, that doesn't make any difference. But if the user actually wanted to update or do something with the contents of their iframe, then that wouldn't work here because we're running the JavaScript in the original page, not within the iframe. So we need to run the JavaScript code on the iframe itself. Again, that's something that we haven't done before. So let's see if we can figure out how to do it. I think we're going to be using the eval command. So let's try eval JavaScript within iframe. Something like that. Okay, that first one looks pretty promising. Any way of getting JavaScript injected into an iframe without removing and reappending it? That is indeed what we want to do. Okay, so this is looking promising. We can take the iframe and look at the content window. So looking at that, we can get the iframe. We can already do that. We then get the iframe's content window, which is iWind in this example, and then we apply the evaluate function to that. Okay, that looks like just what we want to do. So let's do it using good old-fashioned JavaScript. Our iframe has an ID of output panel. So we can use our old friend get element by ID and then a hash and output panel. And then looking over here, we want to use content window to access the content window. That's the contents of the iframe itself. And then we want to eval our code. So in fact, we can just copy this. And that will do essentially the same as what we had before, but it will evaluate the code within the iframe itself, not on the initial page. And just before we run that, you might have noticed I've made a mistake there, confusing my jQuery and JavaScript, which is very easily done, with JavaScript here. Because we're getting an element by ID, we don't need to put the hash in, we just put the ID itself in. All right, let's take a look. Hurrah! So our JavaScript is being run. Would be good to have confirmation that it is indeed being run inside the iframe though. So let's just quickly do that. We could give our paragraph here an ID of paragraph, and then we could edit our JavaScript code so that it just changed the contents of the paragraph instead of alerting something. And then if that works, we know that our JavaScript is being executed inside the iframe. So let's do that. We want document.get elements by ID. The ID here is paragraph. And then we want to change the inner HTML to, let's use my classic alternative, hello Rob. All right, if I've got that correct, then it should update when I refresh. It does indeed. Fantastic. So that's it. We've achieved our objective. We have a really quite nice looking site, pretty simple, but it looks good. We can toggle the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and output on and off as we want. And then as soon as we update any of these, the updates are immediately reflected in the output there. Brilliant. So there's our code player. As always, I hope you managed to do most of that yourself and enjoyed the process of putting it together. This brings us to the end of the jQuery section. So once again, give yourself a pat on the back, but brace yourself because we're soon going to find out how to make great looking responsive websites. That is, ones that respond immediately to the user's screen size and display a different layout depending on whether they're on their phone or their tablet or their computer. We're going to do that using a completely free framework called Bootstrap, and that's all coming in the next